Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming here to hear me share my passion with you. I'm so excited to be here. I call this presentation Birds in a Unique Light, which is just my way of describing my approach to bird photography. I love capturing images of birds that kind of are a little bit different from normal. Maybe they capture interesting behaviors. Maybe they capture birds, in interesting environments. Maybe they use unique lighting conditions. I'm a real big fan of capturing familiar subjects in a different way. Just a little bit more about my background. I was born and raised here in Vancouver, and I really credit my love for birds and my passion for photography with this amazing part of the world that we're very fortunate to get to call home. Um, my earliest memories are just being out in nature with my family. I started taking photos at a very young age and watching birds at a very young age of about 5 years old. At that time, my parents had a little point and shoot camera and a little pair of binoculars. And my parents were not necessarily bird watchers, but they did take me out into the local parks, places like Queen Elizabeth Park and Stanley Park, where something just clicked in my brain and I fell in love with birds and wildlife and photography. And here we are a number of years later, and I'm super fortunate to be doing it for my career. Like I was saying, I do credit this passion for this part of the world that we live in, and I'm sure many people here today are well aware that we are very fortunate to live on the Pacific Flyway, which is this bird migration superhighway, this route that every year millions and millions and millions of birds are taking as they travel between their breeding grounds in, the north of Canada and Alaska and, here in British Columbia, and then all the way south down, some of them all the way to southern South America and beyond. And our position here on the Pacific Flyway means that we have incredible migration spectacles at just about any time of year. One of the most amazing things, in my opinion, that we have in this part of the world is our shorebird migration. And this is something that I spent a lot of time developing my love for birds and my passion for photography over the years was photographing the shorebird migration. In this photo here are Dunlin. We have huge numbers of Dunlin, tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of Dunlin that are here during the winter season. For this photo here, I used a slow shutter speed technique to kind of purposefully capture some of that motion and blur in the wings of the birds. And I love photographing too in that dawn and dusk light, as you see here when you get those beautiful colors in the sky. So Dunlin are definitely one of the more common shorebird species that we have here. We have hundreds of thousands that pass throughout the year, many of them wintering, some just kind of passing through on their migration. But I'm always a fan too of, some of the less common species. One of my favorites of those is the red knot. Um, they're pretty rare, you don't see too many of them. Usually just when you do see them, it's just, maybe one or two of them mixed in with a big flock of other shorebirds during the migration. You probably see more of them in the fall migration too when the birds are heading south, but there's always usually a few that show up on the coast in the spring migration. And I love the spring shorebird migration because you get the birds in their beautiful breeding colors, as you can see here. Now, whenever I'm photographing anything, I always like to capture a variety of different photos. I like to go in for the close-up photos like this one. I like to get photos that capture more of the whole flock like this one, and kind of just tell the story. This here was on the beach and the waves were crashing. This was on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The waves were crashing on the beach, and every time a wave would crash, all the knots would run up the sand, and then as the wave would recede, they'd run back down towards the water. And I realized that I could just position myself above them on the beach, and that every time a wave would crash, they would all come running right up towards me. And that's how I captured this photo here. But with my photography, I also like to go sometimes even wider with the perspective. Here's that same flock of red knots, this time captured kind of within the context of the mudflats. And these intertidal mudflats are really important stopover sites for both resting and also for feeding for so many of these migratory bird species that are passing through the region. We're coming right into that migration window at this time of year. So it's an exciting time of year. I just heard some yellow-rumped warblers outside my place today, which is definitely a sign that spring migration is here. Another bird that I think of when I think of, big numbers and migrants in these parts has to be the snow geese. We get tens of thousands of them wintering in the region and hundreds of thousands migrating through. Again, kind of wanting to take a unique approach with the photography. For this photo here, what I did is I put my camera in a field in Richmond and I used a remote control. And I knew this was a place where snow geese would often gather. There were already some snow geese gathering nearby. And then using a remote control to take pictures, I got this kind of wide angle close-up perspective of all these geese coming in for a landing right around where I had my camera positioned. And if I'd been standing there with my camera, they probably wouldn't have been landing so close to the lens and I wouldn't have been able to get this picture. So it was very much made possible by the remote. I love getting, creative with the techniques like that. Here's another photo of some snow geese in Richmond. This is with the airport lights in the back. And of course, there's constant interaction between the airport and migratory birds like the geese, and the airport trying to keep them away. But the birds do like the airport because it resembles good, open, tundra-like habitat. So, they do all sorts of things to try to keep them away, including but not limited to they have trained raptors that they will use to chase them off the runway. And there's also definitely projects that try to maintain habitat for these birds elsewhere in hopes of attracting them away from the airport. Here's another photo of some snow geese captured with a slow shutter speed, like that photo of the Dunlin that you saw earlier, which shows that blur in the wings. It really captures the chaos. This was the moment that a bald eagle swooped over the flock and spooked them, and they all took into the air at once. It was an amazing thing to photograph. I love seeing those. We call them blast offs. It's such a cool thing to see. This time of year, we are getting more into the time of year too, where we're seeing more and more migratory songbirds. They're not quite here yet, but this is a Townsend's warbler. They'll be here very soon, probably just starting to trickle in the next few weeks. This is probably my favorite of our local migratory warblers. They're just so beautiful. I grew up right on Queen Elizabeth Park. And when you get the right weather conditions, you sometimes can get these migratory warbler fallouts in the park. And this was one of those days where there were just like so many warblers. There was probably like 30 Townsend's warblers in just a few trees, and just made for such incredible bird watching and photography opportunities. For me, it's always a sign of the seasons changing too when we start seeing the swallows. The first swallows can arrive still in winter, like, often the tree swallows start arriving in February, but now is really when they start picking up and we start seeing more and more swallows showing up. Swallows are tricky to photograph. I'm sure if you've ever seen a swallow, you'll have seen that they're constantly flying around. They're aerial insectivores, so they're nonstop in the air, catching bugs in the air. So it's definitely something that requires a lot of patience, a lot of persistence, the right camera settings, like a fast shutter speed in order to get photos like this. But also really important is just you need a spot that gives you lots of opportunities. You want a place where the birds just keep flying by you. Maybe they're nesting nearby, maybe there's good food, but you need to give yourself a place where there's lots of opportunities to try to get a shot like this, because it definitely takes a lot of time and persistence. They're just such beautiful birds. Another one of my favorite spring migrants are the rufous hummingbirds, which have now arrived and are still arriving to the area. It's always a highlight, usually sometime in March when the first rufous hummingbirds show up. They time their arrival with the blossoming of the red flowering currants, this beautiful native flower. And this is a hummingbird that I photographed in a flowering currant bush and kind of purposely photographed through some of the flowers to give it this dreamy kind of pink atmosphere around the hummingbird. This was when I was studying at UBC, and there was a beautiful bloom of flowering currants right during exam season. So in the evenings after studying, I would go out and just watch the frenzy of rufous hummingbirds feeding on the flowers. It was quite beautiful. And this is one of my favorite photos that came out of that season. This was a really interesting lighting condition. The hummingbirds would often be most actively feeding right as it got dark, like right at dusk. And some of these currents were just positioned right along the sidewalks where there was really bright street lighting and sidewalk lighting it up. So the photo in this photo is mostly being lit by just like the sidewalk lights that were lighting up the sidewalk and happened to be hitting these flowers really nicely. There were so many hummingbirds buzzing around. So instead of trying to chase around a hummingbird and constantly move, I just put my camera on a tripod and I pointed it at these flowers, which I thought were really beautiful and had beautiful light hitting on them. And I lined them up with like a dark, shadowy backdrop. And I did not have to wait very long before a hummingbird came right to where I was pointing my camera. And I was able to capture this photo. Another thing that I think is really special about this part of the world is that we are treated to some amazing bald eagle gatherings here. In fact, the biggest gatherings of bald eagles on Earth take place in southwestern British Columbia. One gathering of bald eagles, though, that I've spent a lot of time photographing in recent years and is also the subject of a photography workshop that I run every single summer, takes place in the Discovery Islands, kind of between Vancouver Island and the mainland, where you get really strong tidal currents, which push an abundance of fish, especially hake, up to the surface of the water, and hundreds of eagles will gather to fish on the hake in the tidal currents. And it just makes for a remarkable spectacle for photography. I love bald eagles, but they typically are very, opportunistic scavengers. You see them a lot feeding on dead salmon around the landfill. If, something washes up on the beach, they are capable hunters when they want to. Like I've seen them take out ducks, but it's what's really awesome about this place is that it's full of action. It's so amazing for photography because the eagles are swooping in and grabbing fish off the surface of the water, really high speed action. So it's an amazing opportunity to hone, the bird in flight photography, which can be quite challenging. Um, and over the years, I've really gotten to know this area and understand the behavior of the birds and the lighting conditions and all that sort of stuff to make the best photos possible. So it's always a highlight of the summer season, getting to photograph the bald eagles as they gather to fish for hake. My favorite light is just when you get sunny days at sunset, and the area gets lit up with this beautiful golden light, which you see here, just makes for remarkable conditions for photography. But like I was kind of mentioning earlier, in addition to close-up photos of birds and wildlife, I also like sometimes to take a step back and photograph the larger scene, showcase some of the environment, because these are the photos that often tell some of the story. They tell, the story about not just the animal, but also where that bird lives. And the coast of British Columbia is a really, really beautiful place. If I had to pick one favorite time of year in this part of the world, it would be the fall. There's a couple reasons for that. For one, the fall is migration season. It's when a lot of the birds are migrating south, so we get lots of nice bird diversity in the fall. But what really pushes the fall over the edge to me and kind of makes it stand out from the other times of year is that the fall is when the salmon run is taking place. And the return of the salmon to our coastal rivers here really brings a huge abundance of birds and wildlife to the coast, and it just makes for such incredible experiences. I know the focus of today's presentation is on birds, but I also wanted to throw in just some incidental other animals that I see in my explorations, because the reality is that all these animals are connected. They are interacting, they are in the same ecosystem, and it's the salmon that draw the biggest gatherings of bald eagles. I believe the record count came out of Harrison Mills, and it was like around 10,000 bald eagles in a day. So truly remarkable numbers of bald eagles that are gathering for the salmon. Like I said, though, it's not just the birds that come to eat the salmon. There's a multitude of other animals. Every year, I'm fortunate to guide trips in the Great Bear Rainforest, which is on the central and north coast of British Columbia. And that is an amazing place to see things like bears fishing for salmon. There's a lot of grizzly bears. One of the cool things about getting to guide trips there every year is that you also don't just get to know the place, but you get to know the individual animals and you get to watch the bears grow up. Like these were two siblings, which I've seen for maybe like 4 years now. The first time I saw them, they were little cubs with their mom. Then I saw them as second-year cubs, and this was their third year when they were away from their mom, but still hanging out together and constantly play fighting. And then this last summer, I still saw them, but they were no longer hanging out together. But another thing that makes the Great Bear Rainforest so special is just the environment. It's such a beautiful place. These are grizzly bears, but there are also black bears here on the coast. The grizzly bears often find themselves in the more mainland big estuaries, the black bears more in the smaller rivers on the islands. And they're also a whole lot of fun to photograph as they fish for the salmon. They're very picky eaters. They will often only eat specific parts of the salmon, especially when food is plentiful, like just the eggs, which happens to leave behind leftovers for scavengers. There's a lot of birds that you will find lurking around the rivers in the Great Bear Rainforest and everywhere on the coast of British Columbia where the salmon are spawning. But here's a crow that came in to clean up a pink salmon that had been caught by a bear. But you often see ravens, you often see gulls, you often see in the Great Bear Rainforest, I often actually see Steller's jays sometimes scavenging on the salmon carcasses that have been caught by bears, and they'll eat the eggs too. Um, they're not the only egg eater though. Another one has to be the American dipper. The salmon run in the fall is a great time of year to watch American dippers because they're always really busy in the streams wherever there's salmon spawning, and they'll dive down there and they'll bring up those little salmon eggs. The salmon are laying thousands of eggs. The vast majority of those are not going to survive to be full adult fish because they feed so many different members of this community along their way, starting right as the eggs in the mouths of the American dippers. So a big interconnected ecosystem. And I love capturing photos that kind of showcase the various elements of the ecosystem all in one. Like this photo here is half above water, half underwater. It's taken using a piece of equipment called a dome port, which is basically like a big curved piece of glass, which sets the water a little bit further away from the camera lens and allows you to photograph above water and below water at the same time, though it's still not very easy, but doable. And in this photo here, you can see, in the background, the forest. There's an immature glaucous winged gull standing there, and then below the water, there is a male and female pink salmon. And I love these sorts of photos because I feel like they really capture the story of this ecosystem with the salmon and the predators that are there to eat the salmon and the environments where all these animals live. In the Great Bear Rainforest, there's one type of animal that people always really want to see, and that is the spirit bear. I'm sure you've heard of the spirit bear, but just in case, there is a rare genetic mutation that occurs in the black bear population that is specific to only the Great Bear Rainforest, which basically turns regular black bears into white bears. And there are the latest estimates say that there's maybe just 50 to 150 spirit bears. They're all in that kind of central coast region of British Columbia. And a lot of these individuals are actually very well known because there's only so many individuals that are seen by humans coming to the rivers to fish. This is a female bear named Warrior. She's very recognizable by that scar on her nose. This is Warrior's twin sister, Strawberry, with a cub a couple years ago that she had. And spirit bears are black bears. They just have a mutation. So if she mates with a black bear that has black bear genes, she can have a cub that's black. If she mates with a bear that carries the spirit bear genes, her cub could be white. But it's not uncommon to see moms and cubs that are different colors. And this year, Strawberry had a black-colored cub, which was affectionately named Blackberry. But all of these animals, all these birds and the bears, they're all playing a really important role in the ecosystem. Not only are they, feeding on the salmon, but a lot of these animals often catch the salmon in the river, and they're equipped with tools like the paws of bears or the talons of eagles, and often they carry their catch off into the forest. The eagles will sometimes grab pieces of fish, land in the trees. Bears will often catch salmon, run off into the forest to eat it in a more sheltered place. All these animals are eating the salmon and pooping in the forest. And what this does is it spreads the nutrients from the salmon throughout the forest. And it's not that unusual to walk through the forest and see bits of salmon in the leaf litter. And these salmon decompose, they fertilize the soil, and they lead to growth of the trees. Research shows that the trees grow faster and bigger as a result of the salmon nutrients in the forest that are brought there by eagles and bears and more elusive animals like wolves, which we sometimes see in the Great Bear Rainforest as well. So this is really one big interconnected ecosystem, and it's a combination of the bird migration season and the salmon run that makes the fall season my favorite time of year here on the British Columbia coast. So we've looked a lot at kind of the bird migration and the coastal environment, but another amazing place for bird watching and bird photography that is very close to home here in British Columbia is the mountain environment. It's so cool that, we have access to the coast and we have access to the mountains all within such a short distance. And the mountains are home to some truly unique birds. This here is a white-tailed ptarmigan. Basically a chicken that lives in the high alpine of the mountains, and they constantly are molting their feathers to blend in with their surroundings. So in the summertime, they look like this. They blend in with the soil and the rocks. In the winter, they turn pure white and they blend in with the snow. But there's one mountain region in British Columbia, which is my personal favorite, which has been nicknamed the Haines Triangle. This is the far northwestern corner of British Columbia, another place which I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time. I've probably done about 10 trips up to that area, and it's another place now where I am fortunate to guide tours every year. I've been doing them in the summertime, well, late spring, early summer, for several years, and also starting next year, I'm going to be doing a winter tour there as well. But the Haines Triangle is a really unique place. It is home to one of my favorite birds, pictured here. This is the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is amazing. They hold the record for the longest bird migration of any species on Earth. They spend the breeding season in, the far north, some of them all the way up in the Arctic. They migrate all the way to the Antarctic region for the non-breeding season, and then they return all the way to the Arctic the next year. So that's a journey that can add up to close to 100,000 kilometers every single year. These birds live for decades. They return to the same nesting spots every year. They will meet up with their partner again on the nesting ground. So a truly remarkable bird, and it's that behavior that makes them one of my favorites. So that's a bird that is quite common nesting in the Haines Triangle. It's a cool place because there's so many species that nest in this northwestern corner of British Columbia that are typical of further north environments, and are not very common breeders so far south. In fact, there's some species there where it's the only place in the whole province of British Columbia where they breed, or it's the furthest south place in the world that they breed. An example of one of those would be the wandering tattler. Um, this is a bird in the sandpiper family that spends the non-breeding season in tropical Pacific islands, some of them all the way as far as Australia, and then they head up to, northern Canada into the Arctic to nest, and some of them nest in the Haines Triangle in the far northwest of British Columbia. Semi-palmated plovers like this one are also quite common breeding birds up there. In the wetlands, you often find pairs of trumpeter swans, and it's always a joy to see, the same, presumably what are the same pairs every year in the same wetlands. There's short-eared owls that nest up there in the wetlands. Higher up in the alpine environments, you get birds like horned larks, American pipits, gray-crowned rosy finches, and snow buntings. So another example of a bird that typically nests much further north in the Arctic, but in that far northwestern corner of British Columbia, the habitat really resembles the Arctic in many ways, and you have a lot more of these kind of Arctic-like species nesting up there. It's also a great place for wildlife watching. Grizzly bears have a good population in that area, and I see them most trips. With some effort, you can see grizzly bears. This was an encounter we had on one of the tours last year, a male pursuing a female. In the springtime, there is when they mate, so you sometimes see those behaviors during the late spring season. I'm always a fan, though, of not just photographing the known charismatic species that everyone loves, but also the underdogs, the species that people don't think about as much, like this North American porcupine. It's light, very late up there in the summer. So this was taken at like 11:30 p.m. and there's still some kind of sunset orange glow coming from behind on this porcupine. There are some very elusive mammal species up there. I've seen a wolverine up there once, and I've also seen a couple lynx up there. But those are not animals I ever expect to see, but it's pretty cool to know when you're walking around in that environment that they're there and they're probably seeing you or noticing you a whole lot more than you're noticing them. But my favorite group of animals that are found in that Haines Triangle region has to be the ptarmigan. It's an amazing place to see ptarmigan. And it's very unique because there's three ptarmigan species in the world, the willow ptarmigan, the white-tailed ptarmigan, and the rock ptarmigan. And the Haines Triangle is probably one of very, very few places where it is theoretically and feasibly possible to see all three species more or less in the same vicinity. By far the most common is this one. This is the willow ptarmigan. This is what the males look like in the late spring. They're doing their courtship. It's the best time of year to see them. They're often running around in the open snow and doing their calls, and they're very hormonal. I kind of lovingly refer to it as the hormonal chicken season because they're very active. This is the white-tailed ptarmigan. If you look closely, there is a male on top of the hill there and also a female right below him, camouflaged into the tundra. The white-tailed ptarmigan is probably the rarest ptarmigan up there. They're not probably that rare, they're just more up in the really high tundra. So to see them, you usually have to go for a hike in order to find the white-tailed ptarmigan. And then the second most common one, which is not easy to see, but also not hard to see, just kind of have to look for them a little bit, is this one. This is the rock ptarmigan. And in that late spring season, the males actually retain a lot of their white feathers, but they've got this black face mask and these bright red, what we call eye comb above their eyes, which makes them really, really remarkable. A couple of years ago, I went for a hike up in the Haines Triangle, and I saw something I thought I'd never thought would ever happen, which is basically I saw all three ptarmigan species at the same time. And it was all thanks to this very hormonal male rock ptarmigan, which you see in the front here, who was chasing around anything and everything that came anywhere near him, including myself. But in this photo, he was distracted by a male willow ptarmigan, and he was chasing around this male willow ptarmigan. So in this photo, you can see him with a male willow ptarmigan. But I also photographed him here pursuing a male white-tailed ptarmigan. Interactions between these species probably happen a reasonable amount, but are very rarely actually documented because there's not that much overlap over where you see them. Like often the willow ptarmigans are in the valleys, the rock ptarmigans are a little bit higher up on the slopes, and then the white-tailed ptarmigans are at the very top. But again, in the Haines Triangle, you have overlap between these environments, and I have actually seen interactions between the different ptarmigan species, which is pretty remarkable. Now, it's a beautiful area in the summertime, but I also love visiting these regions in the winter. It's a very different place in the winter. There's a lot less diversity of species around, but it's just such an incredible environment to see how the species that do live there can survive. This is what a willow ptarmigan looks like in the winter. They turn completely white, so they're really, really well camouflaged with the snow. They've got feathery feet to keep their toes warm. It's like built-in snowshoes, and it's pretty cool to watch them walking around in the snow. They do have a little bit of black on them actually when they fly. Their tails are black, and that's what you're looking at here. Those are the black tails of the willow ptarmigans. They're actually much easier to spot if you happen to see them flying, but they don't fly a whole ton. They tend to conserve their energy. This region is probably the most beautiful place I've ever spent time at any time of year, but I think it's at its most visually beautiful in the winter when everything is completely covered in snow. It's just gorgeous. This is what the environment looks like up there in the winter. As a bird and wildlife photographer, though, I'm always trying to wait for a bird or something to fly into the composition. And I actually just captured this photo a week ago. I was up there, and this is a golden eagle flying around with the mountains, the St. Elias Mountains of the Haines Triangle in the background. The golden eagle is one of the few bird species that survives year-round in the winter, along with the ptarmigans, some gyrfalcon, occasionally northern hawk owls, ravens. There's not a ton of bird species in there in the winter, but it's just such a beautiful place to photograph them in that environment. Winter is also a great time to look for some of the wildlife because they really stand out in the snow. This is also just from a week ago when I was up there. That's a red fox on the left side of the screen. You see red fox in the summer too, but they're a lot easier to see in the wintertime because they really stand out in the snowy environment. And it's amazing to watch them in those cold, snowy conditions. They pounce in the snow to capture mice. In the summertime too, I also don't get to see the stars, but because it doesn't get dark. But in the wintertime, it gets really dark and you're so far away from the city lights that you just get beautiful night skies. And I've had some incredible night stargazing out there watching the Milky Way, and also on many nights the Northern Lights come out to dance. And it's so incredibly beautiful. The mountains up of the northwest of BC, though, are not the only place where I will go in the winter to look for birds. The Rocky Mountains are also absolutely beautiful. This was in Banff National Park. I photographed this pair of ravens. For my photography, I love seeking out all sorts of species, but I also just love putting myself in places where I'm in a beautiful environment, and all it takes is just finding a raven to capture a beautiful bird photo because you're already in such a spectacular place. The winter season is also a great time of year to look for owls, and there's several reasons for this. One is there's a lot less foliage, so it's easier to find them because they have less cover. Second reason is, often when it's snowy, they have to work harder to find food, so they're out and about hunting a lot. Third is that there's also a lot of owls that are migratory, and they come further south to where, the habitat is more accessible in the wintertime. And I usually spend about a month every year in Alberta, usually around February, photographing owls. It's another place where I guide photography tours, and it's just such an amazing place to look for owls. This here is a northern pygmy owl. This here is a great horned owl. Here on the coast of British Columbia, our great horned owls are very dark. But in Alberta and further north, there often is beautiful whitish color, and that helps them blend into the snow and some of the lighter colored trees. I even loved how this individual's eyes even matched like the lichens that were growing on the bark of this tree. Here's a great horned owl roosting in a tree cavity. This one's a little bit darker, so it just kind of shows you some of the variability, but this one was also over in Alberta. Now, when I'm approaching photography, again, I always have to decide how I'm going to compose the image. And I just wanted to throw this in here for the photographers to show how a small change can make a really big difference in the photo. Now, some people might prefer the photo on the right, some people might prefer the photo on the left, but just what I'm demonstrating here is how just by zooming the lens in or out, you can really change the look of the photo. The one on the right, I kind of zoomed in close and went for the closer photo of this beautiful barred owl. And the one on the left, I zoomed my lens out and captured the barred owl within the context of the environment to kind of, tell the story of that habitat, that place where the bird lives. I think the favorite owl species for many people that I show around in Alberta is the snowy owl, and I can see why. They're just so beautiful. The way they blend in with the snow and they have those beautiful yellow eyes. Another favorite species is often the great gray owl. And great gray owls are fun to watch. In my opinion, they're actually a lot more entertaining to watch than snowy owls because snowy owls, they don't do very much during the day. They're mostly nocturnal for the most part. Great horned owls, great gray owls, like this one pictured here, they're very active, especially at sunrise and sunset. So you can actually see a lot of behaviors from them hunting, flying around, diving into the snow to try to catch voles. And it also happens to be the time of day with the most beautiful lights, like the sunrise and the fog was so beautiful. When I'm photographing, I'm not just paying attention to the lighting on the subject. I also like to pay attention to the lighting on the background. And in this case, the light was shining on the subject, but not on the background. And it made this great gray owl stand out beautifully against that dark backdrop. Here's one more great gray owl photo. They're just such beautiful birds. Ghosts of the boreal forest. My personal favorite owl species, though, is this one. This is the northern hawk owl. Um, they're very active during the day, completely diurnal, so they're out hunting during the day. When they're out hunting, you usually see them perched at the very tip of trees, which means that when they're out, they can be quite easy to find. They often can also be quite loyal to their favorite trees and habitats, so when you find one, often you'll see it in that same spot many times all winter long. But they're just so beautiful and such unique looking owls. Maybe they resemble a hawk a little bit more in appearance and behavior than some of the other owls do. There's one photo that I was trying to get for many, many years, which was an owl in front of the moon. And I'd kind of had some okay chances over the years, but nothing ever really lined up well until last winter when I was out in Alberta for the tours. I managed to photograph this northern hawk owl lined up with the full moon. This bird is one that I'd been seeing for a while, and I purposely went there as the full moon was rising and managed to line it up with a big telephoto lens, a photo that I'd been dreaming of for a long time, and I was really, really happy to capture. So I've shown you lots of photos from cold climates and more local places, but I'm also fortunate to get to travel abroad to other places for photography. So I thought I'd show some photos here tonight as well from more tropical climates. One place where I'm fortunate to guide trips every year as well is in Ecuador. I'm actually going to be back there in a couple of weeks for another tour. But Ecuador is home to some amazing birds. This is probably my favorite species in Ecuador, though there's so many, it's hard to pick. This is the sword-billed hummingbird, the only hummingbird with a beak the only bird with a beak that's as long or longer than its body. The trips I do in Ecuador, we kind of are split between two main areas. We spend part of the trip in the Andes. The Andes are high in elevation, such a beautiful environment. This is one of the many sought-after species in the Andes. This is a rufous-bellied seed snipe, which is basically the Andean equivalent to our ptarmigan. They're not closely related. The seed snipe is actually in the shorebird family, whereas the ptarmigan is in the grouse chicken family, but they have co-evolved to fill basically the same niche in two different parts of the world. This is another one of my favorite Ecuadorian birds. This is the torrent duck. They are kind of like they kind of remind me a bit of like common mergansers, but they're just super at home in foraging in like really rapid rivers and swimming around in the rivers looking for food. But one thing that draws a lot of people to the Andes are the hummingbirds. There is such a big diversity. And just like a week in the Andes, we often see 50, 60 plus species of hummingbird. There are so many species of hummingbird. There's basically as many species of hummingbird in Ecuador as there are species of birds in Vancouver, in the city of Vancouver, or close to it anyways. It's pretty remarkable. This one is a sparkling violet ear. This one is a tourmaline sun angel. They have such great names, all these hummingbirds. This is just natural light too. Just again, finding the place where the hummingbird's in the light against that dark backdrop in the shade. Here's the close-up of the feathers of another hummingbird. This is called a velvet purple coronet. So many beautiful species with equally beautiful names. Here's some other Andean species. This is a turquoise jay. This plant that it's sitting on is called a bromeliad. They often gather water when it rains, and then birds will sometimes come to the bromeliads and drink water out of the bromeliad after a rainfall, which is exactly what was happening here. This is a beautiful Andean species, the hooded mountain tanager. Again, this kind of looks almost like it was captured in some sort of studio, but this is completely natural light. This is just sunlight on the subject against a background of the forest that's deep in the shade. This one here is called the Andean cock of the rock, and the male cock of the rocks gather in the rainforest at these places called leks, which are basically kind of like communal dance floors. It's a place where a bunch of the males will gather and they'll sing and they'll dance, create a commotion to try to attract the attention of females, and then the females come and they will pick their mate out of all the males that are present on the lek. This is kind of a foggy day, some people don't like foggy days, and I understand for birding it can make it a lot harder to see things, but for photography, it sometimes creates really beautiful conditions, especially in otherwise busy and dense environments. Like in the rainforest, it can be hard to make the subject stand out really well from the background, but just like some thin fog softens the background and actually can make, in the right circumstances, really nice conditions for photography. This is another one of my favorite species in Ecuador. I have a lot of favorite species, as you'll probably notice, but this one holds a special place in my heart. This is the plate-billed mountain toucan. And the plate-billed mountain toucan, on my very first trip to Ecuador, about 10 years ago now, was my 1,000th bird species that I'd ever seen. So a special bird for me because it was number 1,000. So in addition to the Andes, when I'm in Ecuador, I also spend time with my guests in the Amazon rainforest, which is such an amazing place. I mean, it's basically that Amazon to Andes slope is the most biodiverse place on the planet. And there's some really incredible and unique bird and wildlife that's found in the Amazon. This here is a super unique bird called the hoatzin. It basically has no close relatives. It's more or less a one-of-a-kind bird. They're super prehistoric looking and sounding. They're stinky. And if you look closely under the wing of that one in the middle, it's got its baby tucked under its wing. And you often see the babies hanging out with their caretakers. There's one phenomenon, though, in the Amazon that is my personal favorite to photograph and to watch. It are the clay licks. So clay licks are basically places typically where some kind of erosion has occurred that has uncovered nutrient-rich clay or mud that becomes a very important source of minerals for a lot of birds and sometimes a lot of animals. Basically, you get flocks of parrots, parakeets, macaws, other species, they come and they gather and they lick the clay. And the reason they do this is because there's a lot of very acidic and toxic fruits in their diet, and coming to get the minerals from the clay is kind of like the human equivalent would be eating some food and then your stomach is sore, so you take a Pepto-Bismol. That's kind of the equivalent of what these parrots and parakeets are doing when they come eat the clay. They're getting some important nutrients to counter the effects of the acidic and toxic fruits that they're eating. There's three species in this photo here. There's mealy Amazons, which are the big ones that are kind of flying around. There's blue-headed parrots in the middle, and then the little ones kind of above the blue-headed parrots are dusky-headed parakeets. So lots of different species come and gather. Here's another clay-lick. These are scarlet macaws and orange-cheeked parrots. Often those two are some of the more common visitors to this particular clay-lick in the Amazon rainforest. This one is kind of like a cave where there's often water pooling at the entrance, and the birds will come and they'll drink that nutrient-rich water and sometimes eat some of the mud on the edges of the water to get the nutrients. Cobalt-winged parakeets are also often a common visitor to this particular clay lake. Such beautiful birds. Well named, they've got bright blue wings, and I used this slower shutter speed technique again to kind of capture some of that motion blur in the wings as they came in for a landing to accentuate that color. This was the moment when that whole flock took off, and just such a cacophony of sound and color. I've called this photo colorful chaos. So that's the best way I could describe it. But these birds look really cool with that slow shutter speed technique to showcase that motion. So I love spending time in Ecuador. Like I said, I'm going to be there again for another tour in just a couple weeks. Another more tropical place where I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time, and I'm just launching a brand new tour to, is Western Mexico. A little bit closer to us here, actually, about halfway between here and Ecuador, and also home to some amazing bird life. This is the silhouette of a military macaw flying at sunrise. Here's another look at a military macaw. They are quite endangered in a lot of parts of their range, including in Mexico. That is largely a result of habitat loss. They nest in mature pine forests in natural tree cavities like this. This is a nest that this bird is coming out of. And a lot of that has been logged in Mexico. But additionally, there's also been a lot of illegal poaching of these birds in Mexico for just the pet trade. So poachers will come, take chicks right out of the nest, and sell them on the illegal market. And those two things have combined to create a lot of pressure on these birds. But fortunately now, with the onset of ecotourism, there is more financial incentive to, rather than exploit these birds in their environment, to protect these birds in their environment. And I think a lot of the local people would be in favor of doing that regardless of the financial incentive, but the financial incentive has made it much more feasible now that tourists will come and pay to visit the reserves to see these macaws nesting in their natural habitat. And it makes for incredible photography opportunities as well, just to see such a rare, endangered, and beautiful bird nesting at such close range and being taken care of and protected. They'll often have basically 24/7 presence at these sites in order to make sure that they're protected from poachers. And they're just amazing birds to see. They're so loving and tender. They do a lot of allopreening, which is when, a pair gets together and they preen each other's feathers. A lot of fun to watch. It's not just the macaws, though. Up in this tropical forest, there's some really unique birds. This is one of my favorites, the black-throated magpie jay. It's a jay, but it's a jay that kind of is built a little bit like a magpie. In fact, it kind of looks exactly what you'd expect for a bird called a magpie jay. This was a cool moment, though, when it was preening its tail feathers, and they've got such long tail feathers that they have to run their beak down, so it was pretty cool to watch. On these trips I do in Mexico, we also visit the mangrove forests on the coast, which are home to a whole lot of wading birds, herons, egrets, shorebirds, kingfishers, but I think often my favorite to photograph are these guys. These are the roseate spoonbills. A super unique bird, bright pink, kind of look like flamingos, but with big spoon-shaped beaks. The personal highlight to me, though, of trips to Western Mexico is heading offshore to visit nesting seabirds. There's islands on the coast of Mexico that are covered in tens of thousands of nesting seabirds. These are red-billed tropic birds, which nest on the cliffs. These are blue-footed boobies, which nest all around the islands, around the beaches. What's really unique about this place is there's these seabirds, but for a photographer, one of the most special things to have in a place like this is time and access to be able to spend time photographing the subject and at any time of day, like at sunrise and sunset. And these trips that I do to this island, we get basically full unlimited access. We spend several nights there immersed in the world of nesting seabirds, and we get to watch the courtship displays of the blue-footed boobies and the other species right in front of us in the beautiful sunrise and sunset light. Blue-footed boobies are such fun birds. I mean, look at this, as they come in for a landing, they usually do this thing where they'll shoot their feet right up and then they put them down and land. It just makes for the perfect photo opportunity. When there's a little bit of wind, it's actually very helpful for getting a photo like this because they will land facing into the wind. So if you've got some wind, you know which way they're going to be facing when they land at the nesting colony, and you can position yourself accordingly so they all come land facing right at you, and you can get those photos of them with their feet right up in the air. But I love just watching them do their courtship dances. It's so beautiful. They spread their wings and they lift their feet up and down and they make all sorts of calls. The males do like a soft whistle. It's like, I don't know how well that came through, but they do like a high-pitched whistle. The females do more of like a grunting sort of call, but it's amazing to watch them do their courtship. The blue-footed boobies aren't the only boobies on the island. There's also usually a small number of red-footed boobies on the island, and also quite abundant are brown boobies, or actually they recently split the brown boobies, so these are now called cocos boobies. Cocos boobies also nest on the island, and they come in a couple different colors. You can actually see them here. There's a darker one on the left there, and a lighter one on the right. And here's a brown booby with, or a cocos booby rather, since it's been renamed, with a chick, which still has a bit of growing to do, still covered in all the down. So it's amazing to be in a place, it's just like the Galapagos, where the birds have no fear of humans, you're immersed in their world. The key difference is there's basically no tourism out here in Western Mexico, and because of that, there's basically unlimited access. There's no, restrictions in time or anything like that. It's as much time as you'd like to be immersed in their world. I also love photographing the crazy behaviors. The most common seabird nesting on this island are frigate birds. There's maybe 30,000 of them on the island. And the frigate birds, if you know anything about magnificent frigate birds, they are what we call kleptoparasitic. Instead of catching their own food, they steal basically all their food from other birds. So they will often wait for the boobies to be flying into the colonies and the red-billed tropic birds to be flying in with the fish, and then they'll go in and they'll tackle them and force them to basically cough up their catch, and then they'll take their coughed up fish and bring it to feed their own young. The island is absolutely covered in frigate birds. They are everywhere. It's a truly amazing thing to experience. And of course, you get to see their courtship displays too. When I do these trips, I time it with the courtship season for all these birds. And you get to see the male frigate birds. They inflate. They've got this red pouch, and they blow it up, and the females come check them out. And of course, all this leads to the babies. All the courtship is leading to the babies. The boobies have a more specific nesting season, but the frigate birds, their young are in the nest for like a year plus. So any time of year, actually, you can see baby frigate birds of all ages in the nest. This is actually babies of two different ages in this photo. In the front there's a relatively young baby, and in the back is an older juvenile, which is probably just about ready to go on and fend for itself. Again, I love photographing birds in their environment, and one thing that I often watch for in Mexico are beautiful skies. This was a gorgeous phenomenon. These are iridescent clouds, sometimes clouds that are of the right, I don't fully understand it, but the right sort of like ice and moisture composition when they're near the sun can get lit up with all sorts of rainbow iridescent colors. I've seen it a few times down there, and I captured this frigate bird flying in front of those iridescent rainbow clouds. Here's a frigate bird coming in front of a beautiful sunset. There's often such gorgeous sunsets and sunrises out there. And here's a sky full of frigate birds in front of a halo. And you get these halos around the sun when there's a little bit of ice particles and moisture suspended high in the atmosphere. And just when I see conditions like these, that's where I point my lens. It's like, okay, there's this beautiful halo. I need to get underneath the frigate birds and line them up with that beautiful sky. Here's a frigate bird in front of the setting sun out on this island. And here's a frigate bird in front of the moon. Getting photos like this might seem really complicated, but when you're in a place that has tens of thousands of birds, it's a lot easier than it would be otherwise. You just got to get the birds in between you and the moon, and then it's actually not that challenging to get a photo like this. I love bird photography. I love wildlife photography, but another genre of photography that I've gotten really into is actually night sky photography, astrophotography. And over the years, I've actually started to combine my love for bird photography with my love for night photography and capture photos like this. This is also out on this island on the west coast of Mexico. These magnificent frigate birds underneath the Milky Way are far away from the city lights, so the stargazing is incredible. Here's a more creative photo. So this is what's called a double exposure. Basically, back in the film days, you could start your exposure, cover your lens or cover your film, and then continue your exposure with a different scene and kind of blend together two images. So some digital cameras have settings that allow you to mimic this. So basically what I did for this photo is I started the exposure with a big telephoto lens pointed up at the sky at the Orion Nebula. And then I ended the exposure with a wide angle lens of these magnificent frigate birds roosting in a tree on the island. And the result kind of blends these two scenes together into one photo. This is much more abstract and creative because it's kind of blending two scenes together, but it's all done in camera. It's not done in Photoshop or anything like that. It's all done in the camera by doing a double exposure. It's a great place for getting creative. It's not just photographing, birds with the stars. I also just love using these skills to photograph birds at night in general. Here's a crow on a really heavy rainy day out at the crow roost in Burnaby. Every night, tens of thousands of crows, especially in the winter, gather in Western Burnaby to roost, and I love going down there. The birds are often illuminated by the city lights, so when you get rain, that rain gets illuminated, and although it's a really miserable condition to be out in, it makes for incredible photography conditions. Here's another Vancouver urban nighttime shot. Every now and then, barred owls venture into downtown, not just in Vancouver, but in cities all around. And this was something I knew of and I wanted to photograph for a long time. I'd spent a lot of time following up on leads and looking for barred owls downtown. And finally, after several years of being unsuccessful, my friend Chris found a barred owl downtown on the night of Halloween, which was a pretty fun coincidence. And I went down to photograph it and captured this photo here of the owl with just the city lights behind. And it was total chaos. On the night of Halloween, there's people partying and there's people setting off fireworks and there's like fire trucks blaring their sirens. And here's this owl, seemingly undisturbed. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't pleasant for it, but seemingly undisturbed, catching rats successfully amidst all of this chaos. I just think it's a lot of fun capturing photos in these sorts of environments. Like my favorite thing to do as a photographer is just capture unique photos, conditions that, not many people have photographed. And scenes that push the technical skills of photography right to the limits. Here's another example of that. This is an erupting volcano in Hawaii. That's the Halemaumau crater of the Kilauea volcano on the Big Island erupting, so that is lava. And this volcano has created the habitat that the state bird of Hawaii, the nene, or the Hawaiian goose, lives in. The volcano forged their environment, and you find nene around the volcano. And I actually went to Hawaii specifically to try to get a volcanic eruption with the birds that live in the volcanic environment. And there are actually several birds that live in the volcanic environment, and the volcano has directly contributed to their existence. And the nene is one of those birds, a pretty dramatic scene to see. Going back to the night sky, here's a photo I captured of a great horned owl. This was in Southern California with the stars blurred out in the background. This is completely natural light. The lighting on the bird here was from the moon on the horizon. This was, for those familiar with photography settings, this was a 4-second exposure with an aperture of f1.6, which lets in a ton of light and quite a high ISO of 10,000. The way this photo came around was I spent a lot of time out photographing the night sky in the desert of Southern California. It's a great place for night sky photography, and I kept hearing great horned owls. And finally, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to track down one of these great horned owls. So I just waited till I heard one calling, and then I hiked off into the desert toward the owl. And it did not take me long to find it sitting atop this Joshua tree, hooting away under the stars. And I captured this photo here. I'd also had a dream for a long time to photograph birds under the northern lights. And the best opportunity I'd ever had came in May 2024 when we had a huge northern lights storm, which ended up being the strongest northern lights in basically in my lifetime, except for maybe just when I was a little toddler, was maybe the last time there were northern lights this strong. Probably like a 1 in 25 year type of northern lights storm. And I went out to Stanley Park because I was looking for a place where I knew that there might be birds I could find at night. And also they needed to be birds that would be comfortable with human presence. First of all, I didn't want to disturb the birds, but also the northern lights are something you need to photograph with a wider angle lens, which would mean I would need birds that were quite close. And there's often great blue herons in Stanley Park that are very close, don't have a lot of fear of people. And I managed to capture this great blue heron underneath the northern lights. I also managed to capture this pair of Canada geese underneath the northern lights. a pretty cool thing to experience in the urban environment. We don't often get to see Northern Lights in Vancouver, especially not like this. This is much more typical of, something I get to see when I'm up in the Yukon, but every now and then we get the opportunity to see it here. But this May 2024 display was by far the most spectacular Northern Lights display I've ever seen in Vancouver. So it was the perfect opportunity to try to capture photos like this. I've also gotten really into chasing eclipses in recent years. And naturally, as someone who loves the birds and the night sky, I've tried to combine those into single images. So this here is a roosting crow out in Burnaby against a lunar eclipse. So a lunar eclipse is when the Earth's shadow is on the moon. Basically, that turns the moon kind of a blood red, orangey sort of color. It's kind of like a sunset being projected onto the moon. And I really wanted to photograph birds with this lunar eclipse, and I thought, what would be a better subject than a crow? I kind of feel like it matches that kind of haunting energy that you get looking at a photo of a lunar eclipse, which is often called a blood moon. So I thought a crow would make for the perfect subject for that. Also, I knew where to find crows at night. I'd photographed them there at night before, so it was something that I was comfortable with and something I could practice and prepare for in advance. So I managed to capture some photos of these crows in front of the lunar eclipse. But there's another type of eclipse, which is harder to photograph, called a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse is when the moon passes in front of the sun from our perspective here on Earth. There's a couple types of solar eclipses. There's what's called a partial solar eclipse, which is what you see here, which is when the moon partially covers the sun. And then there's also a much rarer and harder to see type of a solar eclipse called a total solar eclipse, which is when the moon completely covers the sun and basically turns daytime into nighttime. This was a partial solar eclipse in October 2023. I had made plans to photograph it here in Vancouver, but unfortunately it was too cloudy, so I went over the day before to Victoria, where the forecast was a little bit better, and sure enough, there was enough gaps in the cloud to photograph the eclipse. And I was trying to line up birds with the eclipse, so I just went to the Victoria waterfront where I knew there'd be lots of gulls and other birds, and I photographed these glaucous-winged gulls in front of the eclipse. I'm just trying to put a new creative artistic spin on bird and eclipse photography. To be honest here, though, I didn't plan for the bird jumping over the top. I was photographing that gull on the bottom, and just so happened while I was photographing that gull that the second gull flew right over it and landed next to it, which is how I captured this photo. Here's another photo of a partial solar eclipse. This one is at sunrise. For this one, I traveled to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Quebec. And this is an American black duck photographed in the reflection of the rising sun, which is partially eclipsed by the moon. But for a long time, my dream photo was a bird in front of a total solar eclipse. So just as a reminder, total solar eclipses are when the moon completely covers the sun and basically turns daytime into nighttime. They happen on average about once every year and a half, but when they happen, they just can be visible on very specific small parts of the world along a tiny little line, which we call the path of totality. So if you don't travel to go see a total solar eclipse, most people will never see one. On average, anywhere on Earth, they happen something like once every 300 to 500 years. So if you're going to see a total solar eclipse, you're generally going to need to go travel to see one. And in April 2024, there was a total solar eclipse that crossed an area that I was quite familiar with, the west coast of Mexico. And I traveled there after well over a year and a half of planning and about a week of on-site scouting. I put myself in the right place where a bunch of magnificent frigate were coming to rest. And my theory was that as the sun covered the moon and it became nighttime, that all these frigate would probably come into their roost because it's like nighttime, it's really dark. And that was exactly what happened. As the eclipse took place, it lasted about 4.5 minutes. The frigate flew right in. I used a small boat so I could maneuver the boat to get underneath them, and I was able to capture photos of the frigate with the total solar eclipse in the sky. This specific moment is called the diamond ring. It's when just a tiny sliver of the sun pokes out and kind of gives the eclipse a ring-like look, and that lasts just a few seconds. So this was my dream photo and the result of a whole lot of preparation and planning. So with that, I hope I've just shared my passion, my love for birds, my love for shedding, a unique light on them, capturing them in different ways. Um, I will also just take a brief moment before we go to questions to just talk about the types of trips that I do. So I do several tours. Some of them are more for photography. Some of them are also great for people who aren't into photography. They do tend to sell out quite far in advance. So if you are interested in joining any of these tours, my strong recommendation would be to send me an email. I'll have the email up on screen later and tell me that you're interested. And that way, usually what happens is if there's people who've told me they want to come on a trip, I will give them the chance to book first because they've told me they want to come before I open it up publicly. And these days, very few of them get opened up before, because usually it's just people who told me they want to come who end up coming on the trip. But some of the trips I do are bald eagle and coastal wildlife photography based out of Campbell River. We also see a lot of whales on those trips. I do trips in the Great Bear Rainforest to look for spirit bears, grizzly bears, wolves, all sorts of seabirds. We often see like shearwaters and auklets and tons of eagles and dippers and kingfishers, phalaropes, all sorts of species. I do a birding tour up in the Haines Triangle and the Yukon in the late spring. And I do a tour in Ecuador. These trips I haven't announced 2027 dates for just yet because they're kind of later in the year, but all the 2026 dates are sold out. But if you're interested in joining in 2027, send me an email. And a few more that I do. I just today announced, just to the people who had told me they want to come, the Mexico seabird trip for January 2027. And there's just one spot left on it now. But if you do want to come, let me know. We're going to go out and see all these amazing birds in Western Mexico. I also do trips for owls and other winter birds in Alberta, and also winter trips in the Yukon to see the northern lights and the foxes and the ptarmigan and all the incredible scenery that is up there. So if you're interested in any of these trips, let me know. Like I said, a lot of these are geared towards photographers, but some of them, especially like the Great Bear Rainforest trip and the Haines Triangle birding trip, also work really, really well for non-photographers too. So if you have any questions about any of them, just send me a note. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for having me. It's always an honor to get to share my passion with you. I have my links on screen here, so my email address is there on the bottom right. What you can also do is if you use your phone and you take a picture of the QR code, that square in the bottom left, it should prompt you with a link where it'll pull up all of these links on your phone, and then you don't have to like type them out. It'll just have them for you on your phone. Um, but anyways, yeah, thank you so much for having me, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Liron. That was incredible. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the evening. I'll start with a couple of questions from the chat and then we'll continue from there. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see if anyone's raised their hand. I don't see anything. So I'll start with my own question. Liron, do you ever feel a sense of responsibility toward the animals you've come to know over time? And how does that shape the way you photograph or share their stories?
Absolutely, yes. So I do think that, as someone who is out there a lot in nature, I'm doing something that most people don't do. I'm seeking out animals. Most people don't do that. Which means that I'm naturally going to have more of an impact on them because I'm actually looking for them. And that also means that there is a greater responsibility. So for me, the ethics of it are really important. My goal is typically to leave a scene as I found it. So if there was an owl hunting when I showed up, ideally it's still hunting when I left. If there's an owl sleeping when I showed up, ideally it's still sleeping when I leave, unless maybe it becomes night and then it goes off to hunt. But I want to leave the birds and the animals leaving naturally. And I do think that as birders and photographers, people are seeking them out actively, we kind of have that extra responsibility to try to have as little of an impact as possible. So that is something that I do definitely try to carry forward, especially in all the tours that I do. It's always kind of a minimal impact. We are observing the natural behaviors as they are and not interfering with them, which ultimately, in my opinion, does lead to the best photos because you don't get crazy natural courtship behaviors and predator-prey interactions when the animals are freaked out by you. You only get those when you're being respectful and you're being patient. I also think that as, a bird photographer and a wildlife photographer, not only is it important to respect these things, but it's really important to me that I use my photos to just educate about these birds and about these places and about these ecosystems and the issues that they're facing. Because not many people get the chance to experience these things in person. A lot of people won't be aware of the issues that they're facing, and I do believe that, visual storytelling through photography can be a great way to educate about these issues and hopefully make people care about them and want to protect them.
Thank you, Liron. That was beautiful. I have a comment from Murray. Fantastic. Thanks, Liron. I used to lead Stanley Park Discovery walks and remember you with camera and binos with your mom. Your passion was obvious even then. And Holly Becker has a question. Any funny stories of near misses of photos?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the photos that you're seeing here are probably about, and I'm not exaggerating, the photos in this presentation are about probably 1 in 10,000. So for every photo you saw in this presentation, I'm not exaggerating. There are literally 10,000 photos that you didn't see. So I miss a lot more photos than I get. Um, yeah, there's always so many near misses, like you're snowshoeing through the snow, and right as you lift your camera, the snow collapses and you fall down, and, and then the bird leaves. Stuff like that happens all the time, or you spend hours searching for, the bird that you hear singing only for it to turn out to be a European starling that was mimicking, yeah, like an astronid flycatcher that I was looking for. So there's all sorts of funny stories like that. But there's definitely a whole lot more misses than there are successful photos. I just only show you the good ones.
Anne Housen says, incredible photos and presentation. Thank you so much, Liron. Um, Joan had a question. Oh, she had a comment first. She said, excellent photos and stories. Thank you for sharing. What sizes of lenses do you carry with you in the field?
Really great question. So, I'm a big fan of portable and lightweight lenses. There are, if money is no issue, there are huge, incredible lenses that you can buy. But my style of photography is I'm often trying to capture fleeting moments, things that don't last very long. So for me, it's important to be able to respond quickly. And if I'm carrying a camera setup that weighs 15 pounds, I'm probably not going to be able to respond quickly enough to get a lot of the photos that I'm trying to get. So the main lens that I use is a Canon 100 to 500 millimeter zoom lens. It weighs maybe like 2.5 pounds or something like that. And I can really quickly lift it up. It has a lot of focal length of 500 millimeters, but it's also versatile. If I want to photograph something that's a little bit more environmental and landscape, I can zoom out to 100 millimeters. So that's my main lens. But I usually travel with three lenses. So usually I travel with a 100 to 500 millimeter, a 24 to 105 millimeter, which kind of covers that wider to mid range. On a place like that island in Mexico where the seabirds are all around you in all directions, that's a really nice lens to have because they're often quite close. And then I also travel with a 14 millimeter lens, which is not used as often for, bird photography. But sometimes it is used. And actually, some of my favorite photos have been captured with a 14 millimeter lens, like this one, for example. This was captured with my 14 millimeter. This one was also captured with my 14 millimeter. So those are the three lenses I usually travel with. The 100 to 500 millimeter, the 24 to 105, and then the 14 millimeter, 14 being like the ultra wide angle lens.
Thanks, Liron. Janice says, fantastic. Thank you. Mel said, excellent as always, Liron. Daphne says, it's a joy to see your stunning photos, Liron. We had a couple more questions. Joyce had a question about the length of trip. Are they approximately 10 days?
Yeah, so these tours, it depends on the tour. Some of them, like the Mexico one, is 10 nights. The Alberta tours are 6 nights. The Yukon winter one will probably also be 6 nights. The ones here range from 5 nights to, 13 nights would be the longest one I do in Ecuador. So it depends on the trip. I'm definitely a fan of taking my time. Like I don't like to go places for 1 or 2 days. Like I like to be able to spend time there and get to fully experience all the things that any given location has to offer.
Thank you, Liron. Ann Housen asks, where in the world would you now like to visit for bird and wildlife photography?
I like that question. Well, I am very fortunate to be very well traveled, but I still have not been to most places in the world. One place that I would really love to go to is kind of the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic region. I love places that really allow you to get creative with photography and whenever you've got lots of seabirds or lots of penguins in beautiful environments, it definitely makes that possible. And I'm happy to say that that is basically will be at least somewhat of a reality later this year. I'm going to the Falkland Islands, which is kind of sub-Antarctic, for a month, just to immerse myself in penguin colonies and albatross colonies for a month, and just do some personal photography there. I'm looking forward to that later this year.
Thank you. Holly Becker asks, how many photos worth keeping do you get in a day or trip?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends. Some things, some places, like for example, if I'm at a seabird colony in Mexico, it's very easy to get lots of good photos. Other times, like I was just up in the Yukon looking for lynx and ptarmigan and hawk owls, and when you're looking for harder things, sometimes you can be out for a week and get zero photos that you're happy with. So it does really, really depend. Typically, too, as I keep getting better photos, the standards change. So even if I got a bunch of good photos the first day, if I get better ones the next day, I'm probably not going to care that much about the photos the first day anyways. So I would say, I typically for me, it'd be nice to get like one good photo a day or something like that. But depending on what I'm photographing, there could be many days that I don't get good photos. Certainly, though, on the trips that I designed to be tours, they are designed around opportunities where we are very likely to get lots of good photos every day. But in my personal work, I tend to be quite picky. And like I said earlier, I end up showing people maybe only one photo for every 10,000 that I take. I do take 10,000 photos pretty quickly, though. I've definitely done that in a few hours before. Just the cameras these days take like 20 or 30 photos a second. So if there's something amazing happening in front of you, it actually doesn't take that long to pile up thousands of photos.
Thank you, Liron. Poe had a question. How do you protect your eyes when you photograph birds during eclipses?
That's a really, really good question. So yes, you don't want to ever look directly at the sun. So if you're just observing a solar eclipse, it's really important that you use eclipse glasses, which are basically glasses that block out 99.9% of light so you can just see the sun. If you're photographing an eclipse, you also don't want to damage your sensor. For photos like this and photos like this, where my camera is pointed directly at the surface of the sun, I do have a filter on my camera lens that blocks out the vast majority of light and protects the camera sensor. The good news is most new cameras these days are mirrorless cameras. Like I'm shooting on a Canon R5 and R5 Mark II, which are mirrorless cameras. So when you're looking through the camera, you're not actually looking through the lens with your eyes. You're looking at a screen, an electronic display, which means that even if you did point your camera straight at the sun, the worst case scenario is that you're going to fry your camera, but your eyes will be okay. And although I don't want to fry my camera, the most important thing is that my eyes are okay. So I'm definitely not ever going to do anything that's going to risk damaging my eyes. And I also will protect my camera with a filter, but the good news is with a mirrorless camera, there's no way your eyes can get damaged anyways because you're just looking at a screen. I will mention though that during a total solar eclipse, when the moon completely covers the sun, during that total phase, which lasts a few minutes, you don't need any special protective equipment to look at the eclipse because the sun is completely behind the moon. But the second even a sliver of the sun pokes out, you're going to have to get protective eyewear or protective filters back on your eyes or your camera.
It's so fascinating that you have to think about protective gear during photographing eclipses. Um, Joan had a question. When you are in the Andes, are you targeting feeders to get all the hummingbirds?
Great question. So yeah, hummingbird feeders in Ecuador are definitely by far the easiest way to find hummingbirds. It's a pretty spectacular phenomenon to be at a hummingbird feeder, and there's just like literally sometimes 20 species of hummingbirds coming to one feeder in like just the course of like 30 minutes. So feeders are definitely an incredible way to observe and photograph them. That said, there's also lots of like flower gardens and stuff like that too, where you can watch and photograph them on the flowers. So it's definitely a mix of environments. In some places too, like in the Amazon, the hummingbirds don't even come to feeders very much because there's just such an abundance of flowers. But feeders are definitely the best way to see as many hummingbird species as possible because they will just attract a whole lot of hummingbirds into a small area. And here in Vancouver, I also even maintain a little hummingbird feeder outside the window just because I love watching the Anna's hummingbirds and the occasional Rufus hummingbird coming to feed.
Thanks, Liron. Lisa had a question. Have you done much work in Eastern Canada, either Newfoundland or Quebec? If yes, what are your favorite places?
Yeah, we have an amazing country from coast to coast. I definitely have. I haven't spent tons of time in Quebec, but I have spent some time on the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and it was beautiful. Get to see like eiders, lots of other seabirds. I have spent time in Newfoundland. That is an amazing place. So many birds, such beautiful scenery, and great people, which is also amazing. I would say my favorite place in Newfoundland is probably Cape St. Mary's, which has a amazing big colony of northern gannets, and there's also common murres, a few thick-billed murres, razorbills, cormorants, kittiwakes. So yes, I love Newfoundland. That is definitely one of my favorite places in Canada.
Thanks, Liron. Holly has another question. Do you bother bringing binoculars when you go out or just photography gear?
Another good question. I absolutely bring binoculars when I go out. So for me, I strongly believe that in order to be a good bird photographer, you have to be a good birder too. Um, although I was taking pictures from the start with a little point and shoot camera, I very much started more, my passion was in birding. Trying to find as many species as possible, trying to take full advantage of the migration season, just get beautiful views of all the species I would find in my neighborhood. So absolutely, binoculars are something I will never leave the house without. In fact, I sometimes leave the house with only binoculars and not my camera. I never go out with just my camera and no binoculars. So binoculars are probably the equipment that I use more than almost anything else. And the better you get at honing the birding skills, like spotting the birds, understanding their behaviors, learning to identify them, learning about the habitats where they live, the better all those birding skills get, the easier time you're going to have trying to photograph them. So binoculars are super important.
Thanks, Liron. I'll ask my own question. Has photography become a way of slowing down and learning to notice more carefully? If so, what has it taught you to pay attention to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think definitely when I started out in this realm, it was for me, and I fully understand and respect all forms of the way people love to do birding and photography. But for me, when I started, it was more about trying to see lots of different species and get a look at them, but then going on to look for the next thing. But the more I do this, the more I appreciate just everything, even the common birds that I get to see every day, like the chickadees and the house finches and American robins. Even the common things are fascinating to me. I think one thing I really love doing now and just more every day is spending time watching just like one bird or one place for a long period of time, because that is when you really get to see the most remarkable behaviors. If you're watching a bird for just like a minute, you're probably not going to see it doing very much. But if you watch it for hours or days or weeks, you might get to see courtship. You might get to see it hunting. You might get to see it fleeing a predator. You might get to see it, standing off with a rival. There's so many amazing behaviors that you might get to see. So I definitely love taking my time and really getting to know, the birds and the places that I observe. And it definitely, yeah, I think it just makes you more detail oriented. It makes you notice more little things and appreciate more little things. And there's never an end to like the little things that you'll notice. Like I just find the more time I spend observing, even something that I've been already been observing for so long, the more I keep learning about them.
Thank you, Liron. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'll ask another one of my own questions. In your work, how do you decide when to photograph an animal as a representative of its species and when to tell the story of a particular individual?
Oh yeah. Really good question. I mean, I think I just kind of let this specific scenario dictate that. So for me, if I'm going to try to tell more of a story of a subject, It's usually a subject that is gonna allow me to spend a lot of time there. Um, which means it has to be a subject that's comfortable with my presence, that I'm not going to be having a negative impact on, and something that I have the time to get to know. So often the best stories are told in the places where you have sufficient time to be. And in order to tell the best stories, you need the photos that are not just the close-up shot, but also the environmental shot, not just the portrait, but also the behavior. And maybe also a really important photo can be that photo that showcases the human environment, and the ways that the human world is interacting with the natural world. I don't know if that fully answered the question, but hopefully that was kind of along the lines of what you were looking for.
That was beautiful. Thanks, Liron. Thank you again for such a beautiful and inspiring presentation and for sharing your work and stories with us tonight. I think many of us are here because of moments like the ones you've just shared, ways of noticing birds that stay with us. And thank you to everyone that joined us this evening and contributed such thoughtful questions, whether in the chat. Just a reminder that Birders Night takes place on the first Thursday of each month, and we hope to see you at our next talk.